It was supposed to be a routine flight, but one moment of arrogance would change everything. John and Linda, a couple in their late 60s, settled into their seats with quiet excitement. They were flying first class for the first time, a gift from their children to celebrate their 40th wedding anniversary. John, a retired mechanic, wore his best suit, a little worn at the edges but neatly pressed. Linda, a former schoolteacher, clutched her handbag tightly, her eyes sparkling with gratitude. They were simple people, unaccustomed to luxury, but today felt like a dream come true. Clara, the lead flight attendant, moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency. She was polished, confident, and carried an air of superiority. When she reached John and Linda, her smile faltered. She glanced at their modest attire and the small, worn suitcase they'd brought on board. Her tone shifted from professional to dismissive. "Are you sure you're in the right section?" Clara asked, her voice dripping with condescension. John smiled politely. "Yes, ma'am. First class, row 3. Clara raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. She leaned in slightly, her voice low but loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "First class is for our premium guests. You might be more comfortable in economy." Linda's face flushed with embarrassment. John's jaw tightened, but he remained calm. "We have our tickets right here," he said, handing them over. Clara barely glanced at them. "Well, I suppose we'll make an exception this time," she said with a forced smile. She turned to a colleague and muttered under her breath, "Some people just don't know their place." The couple exchanged a pained look but said nothing. They were used to being overlooked, to being treated as less than. But this felt different, more personal, more humiliating. As the flight took off, Clara continued her duties, her demeanor cold and detached. She served champagne to the other passengers but, accidentally, skipped John and Linda. When Linda politely asked for a glass of water, Clara sighed audibly and handed her a plastic cup without a word. The other passengers began to notice. Whispers spread through the cabin. Who were this couple, and why were they being treated so poorly? Then, as Clara passed by their row again, John reached out gently. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice steady but firm. "We'd appreciate a little respect. We may not look like much, but we've earned our place here just like everyone else." Clara stopped in her tracks. She turned to face him, her expression a mix of annoyance and disbelief. "Respect?" she said, her voice sharp. "Respect is earned, not handed out like free peanuts. Maybe next time, dress the part if you want to be treated like first-class passengers." The cabin fell silent. Linda's eyes filled with tears, and John's hands trembled with suppressed anger. Clara walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, oblivious to the storm she had just unleashed. But someone else had been watching closely. An elderly man in the row across the aisle, Mr. Thompson, observed the entire exchange with a furrowed brow. He leaned over and whispered to John, "Don't let her get to you. Sometimes, the people who act the toughest are the ones hurting the most." John nodded, but his heart was heavy. He couldn't shake the feeling that this flight would be anything but ordinary. Little did anyone know, Clara's life was about to take a dramatic turn, one that would force her to confront the very thing she had spent years running from. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Clara's words hung in the air like a dark cloud, casting a shadow over what should have been a joyous occasion for John and Linda. The other passengers exchanged uneasy glances, some murmuring in disapproval, others too uncomfortable to speak up. Linda dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her hands trembling. She had always been the emotional anchor of their marriage, the one who held things together when life got tough. But this was different. The public humiliation cut deeper than any hardship they'd faced before. John reached over and gently squeezed her hand. "Don't let her get to you, Linda," he whispered. "We've been through worse, remember?" Linda nodded, but the tears kept coming. I don't understand why she's being so cruel. We didn't do anything wrong." John sighed, his heart aching for his wife. He glanced toward the front of the cabin, where Clara was now chatting with another flight attendant, her laughter ringing out as if nothing had happened. The sound grated on his nerves. A few rows ahead, Mr. Thompson, the elderly man who had offered words of comfort earlier, watched the scene unfold with a mix of sadness and resolve. He had seen enough. Quietly, he unbuckled his seatbelt and made his way to the couple's row. "Mind if I join you for a moment?" he asked, his voice warm and reassuring. John and Linda looked up, surprised but grateful for the kindness. "Of course," John said, gesturing to the empty seat beside him. Mr. Thompson sat down and leaned in slightly, his eyes filled with compassion. "I couldn't help but overhear what happened," he said. "I just want you to know that her behavior says more about her than it does about you." Linda managed a small smile. "Thank you. That means a lot." Mr. Thompson nodded. "Sometimes, people act out because they're carrying pain they don't know how to deal with. It doesn't excuse what she did, but it might help to remember that." As he spoke, Clara walked past their row again, this time carrying a tray of drinks. She glanced at the trio briefly but quickly looked away, her expression unreadable. John cleared his throat, his voice steady but firm. "Excuse me, miss," he called out. Clara stopped and turned, her face a mask of indifference. "Yes?" John met her gaze, his eyes filled with quiet strength. "We'd like to request a different flight attendant for the remainder of the flight. Your behavior has been unacceptable, and we'd prefer not to interact with you further." The cabin fell silent once more. Even the hum of the plane's engines seemed to fade into the background. Clara's cheeks flushed, but she quickly regained her composure. "I'm afraid that's not possible," she said coolly. "But I'll do my best to accommodate your needs." Her tone was clipped, her words carefully chosen to avoid further confrontation. But the damage had already been done. The other passengers were now fully aware of the tension, and whispers began to spread like wildfire. "Did you hear what she said to them earlier?" one passenger murmured. "I can't believe she's treating them like that," another replied. Clara could feel the weight of their stares, but she refused to back down. She straightened her posture and continued down the aisle, her head held high. As she disappeared into the galley, Mr. Thompson turned back to John and Linda. "You handled that with grace," he said. "Not many people would have been so composed." John sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "We've learned over the years that you can't control how others treat you, but you can control how you respond." Linda nodded in agreement, her tears finally drying. "We just want to enjoy our anniversary. This trip was supposed to be special." Mr. Thompson smiled gently. "And it still can be. Sometimes, the hardest moments lead to the most meaningful outcomes." His words lingered in the air, leaving John and Linda with a sense of hope they hadn't felt since the flight began. But as they settled back into their seats, they couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play, something that would change all of their lives forever. As the flight continued, the atmosphere in the cabin remained tense. Passengers exchanged hushed conversations, their eyes occasionally darting toward John and Linda or the galley where Clara had retreated. The couple tried to focus on each other, sharing quiet words of encouragement, but the weight of Clara's cruelty lingered like a storm cloud. Mr. Thompson, the elderly man who had offered his support earlier, remained seated beside them. His presence was a comforting anchor in the midst of the turmoil. After a few moments of silence, he leaned in again, his voice low but filled with conviction. "I don't mean to intrude," he began, "but I feel compelled to tell you something. What happened here today, it's not just about a rude flight attendant. There's more to this story than meets the eye." John and Linda exchanged curious glances. "What do you mean?" Linda asked, her voice tinged with both hope and apprehension. Mr. Thompson hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. Let's just say that Clara's actions today are rooted in something much deeper than a bad attitude. She's carrying a burden, one she may not even fully understand herself. John frowned. That doesn't excuse how she treated us. Of course not, Mr. Thompson agreed. But sometimes, understanding why someone acts the way they do can help us find peace, even in the most difficult situations. Linda's eyes softened. Do you know her? Is that why you're saying this? Mr. Thompson shook his head. I don't know her personally, but I've seen enough in my life to recognize pain when I see it. And Clara, she's hurting. Deeply. The couple fell silent, processing his words. Meanwhile, in the galley, Clara was struggling to maintain her composure. She busied herself with tasks, refilling drink carts and organizing supplies, but her hands trembled slightly. The confrontation with John and Linda had shaken her more than she cared to admit. As she reached for a stack of napkins, a colleague approached her. Hey, Clara, are you okay? You seem off. Clara forced a smile. I'm fine. Just tired, that's all. Her colleague hesitated, clearly unconvinced. You know, if you ever need to talk, I'm here. Clara nodded but said nothing. She wasn't used to opening up, to showing vulnerability. It was easier to keep her walls up, to push people away before they could get too close. Back in the cabin, Mr. Thompson stood up, his movements slow but deliberate. I think it's time I had a word with her, he said. John and Linda looked at him in surprise. Are you sure that's a good idea? John asked. Mr. Thompson smiled gently. Sometimes, all it takes is one person to break the cycle. And if I can help her see the truth, maybe something good can come out of all this. Before they could respond, he made his way toward the galley. Clara was just stepping out when she nearly collided with him. Oh, excuse me, she said, her tone polite but distant. Mr. Thompson held up a hand. No need to apologize. I was actually hoping to speak with you for a moment. Clara's expression tightened. If this is about what happened earlier, I've already addressed it. I don't have time for. It's not about that, Mr. Thompson interrupted, his voice calm but firm. It's about you. Clara blinked, caught off guard. Me? What about me? Mr. Thompson studied her for a moment, his gaze piercing yet kind. You remind me of someone I used to know. Someone who spent so much time building walls that she forgot how to let people in. Clara crossed her arms, her defenses rising. I don't know what you're talking about. Maybe not, Mr. Thompson said. But deep down, I think you do. You've been carrying something heavy for a long time, haven't you? Clara's breath hitched, but she quickly masked it with a scoff. Look, I appreciate your concern, but I'm fine. Really? Mr. Thompson nodded, as if he'd expected her response. Fair enough. But just know this, sometimes, the things we run from have a way of catching up to us. And when they do, it's better to face them head-on than to keep pretending they don't exist. With that, he turned and walked back to his seat, leaving Clara standing in the aisle, her mind racing. His words had struck a nerve, stirring emotions she had buried long ago. As she returned to the galley, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, something she wasn't ready for. The flight was halfway to its destination, but the tension in the cabin showed no signs of easing. Clara, now visibly unsettled, tried to focus on her duties, but her mind kept drifting back to Mr. Thompson's words. Sometimes, the things we run from have a way of catching up to us. What did he mean? And why did it feel like he knew something she didn't? Meanwhile, John and Linda sat quietly, their hands intertwined. They were grateful for Mr. Thompson's kindness but still reeling from the earlier confrontation. Linda leaned her head on John's shoulder, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you think she'll apologize? She asked. John sighed. I don't know, Linda. Some people never do. But we can't let her actions ruin our anniversary. We've worked too hard for this. Linda nodded, but her eyes were distant. I just wish I understood why she was so cruel. We didn't do anything to her. Before John could respond, Mr. Thompson returned to their row, his expression thoughtful. May I sit with you again? He asked. Of course, John said, gesturing to the empty seat. Mr. Thompson settled in and leaned closer, his voice low. I spoke with Clara. I didn't get through to her, but I think I planted a seed. There's something she needs to hear, something you both need to hear. John and Linda exchanged puzzled glances. What are you talking about? Linda asked. Mr. Thompson hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. What I'm about to tell you may come as a shock, but I believe it's the truth. Clara, she's not just a flight attendant who had a bad day. She's your daughter. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. John and Linda stared at him, their faces a mix of disbelief and confusion. Our daughter? John repeated, his voice trembling. Mr. Thompson nodded. 40 years ago, you made the difficult decision to give up a child for adoption. Clara is that child. Linda's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. No, that's impossible. How could you know that? Mr. Thompson's expression softened. I was the social worker who handled your case all those years ago. I never forgot you, or her. When I saw her name on the crew manifest, I knew I had to be on this flight. John's mind raced as memories came flooding back. The sleepless nights, the tearful goodbyes, the hope that their child would have a better life than they could provide at the time. It had been the hardest decision of their lives, one they rarely spoke about but never forgot. But how can you be sure it's her? John asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Thompson reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. It was a picture of a baby, wrapped in a blanket, with a handwritten note on the back, to our little one, with all our love. May you have the life we couldn't give you. Linda gasped, her hands trembling as she took the photo. This is the picture we gave her. How did you get this? Clara's adoptive parents gave it to me years ago, Mr. Thompson explained. They wanted her to know where she came from, but she never wanted to look into it. She's spent her whole life running from her past. The weight of his words settled over them like a heavy blanket. Linda clutched the photo to her chest, tears streaming down her face. All this time, she was right here, and we didn't even know. John's eyes were wet with tears as well. We have to tell her. She deserves to know the truth. Mr. Thompson nodded. I agree. But we need to be careful. This is going to shake her to her core. She may not react the way we hope. As the three of them sat in stunned silence, Clara emerged from the galley, her expression unreadable. She glanced in their direction, her eyes briefly meeting Linda's before she quickly looked away. The moment was fleeting, but it was enough to send a jolt through Linda's heart. She turned to Mr. Thompson, her voice filled with determination. We have to talk to her. Now. Clara stood in the galley, her hands gripping the edge of the counter as she tried to steady her breathing. Mr. Thompson's words echoed in her mind, stirring up emotions she had spent years burying. Sometimes, the things we run from have a way of catching up to us. She didn't want to think about it. She didn't want to feel it. But the harder she tried to push the thoughts away, the more they clawed at her. Clara had always been a fighter. Growing up, she learned early on that the world wasn't kind to those who showed weakness. Her adoptive parents, though well-meaning, were strict and emotionally distant. They provided for her materially but struggled to connect with her on a deeper level. As a child, Clara often wondered why she didn't look like her parents or why she felt like she didn't belong. When she was 10, she found the photograph tucked away in a drawer, a baby wrapped in a blanket, with a note she couldn't bring herself to read. It was the first time she realized she was adopted. The discovery shattered her. She felt abandoned, unwanted, and utterly alone. She began to build walls around herself, determined never to let anyone close enough to hurt her again. In school, Clara was the girl who never cried, no matter how cruel the other kids were. She was the one who fought back, who refused to back down. By the time she reached adulthood, she had perfected the art of keeping people at arm's length. Her career as a flight attendant suited her perfectly. It allowed her to maintain a sense of control, to keep moving, to avoid forming attachments. She prided herself on her professionalism, her ability to remain detached even in the most challenging situations. But today, something was different. The couple in row 3, John and Linda, had stirred something in her that she couldn't explain. Their quiet dignity, their refusal to retaliate, had struck a nerve. And then there was Mr. Thompson, with his cryptic words and piercing gaze. Clara shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. She didn't have time for this. She had a job to do. As she stepped back into the cabin, she noticed Mr. Thompson walking toward her. Her stomach tightened, but she forced herself to remain composed. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but distant. Mr. Thompson studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I think it's time we had a real conversation," he said. Clara crossed her arms, her defenses rising. "If this is about what happened earlier, I've already said all I need to say." "It's not about that," Mr. Thompson replied. "It's about you. About who you are, and where you come from." Clara's breath hitched, but she quickly masked it with a scoff. "I don't know what you're talking about." Mr. Thompson reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph. He held it out to her, his hand steady. "This is you," he said quietly. Clara stared at the photo, her heart pounding. She recognized it instantly, the same photo she had found all those years ago. The same photo she had buried in the back of her mind, along with the questions she was too afraid to ask. "Where did you get this?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "From your adoptive parents," Mr. Thompson said. "They wanted you to know the truth, but you never gave them the chance to tell you." Clara's mind raced. She wanted to run, to hide, to do anything but face this moment. But something in Mr. Thompson's eyes held her in place. "The truth?" she whispered. Mr. Thompson nodded. "The couple in row 3, John and Linda, they're your birth parents." The words hit Clara like a punch to the gut. She stumbled back, her legs threatening to give out. "No, that's not possible." "It is," Mr. Thompson said gently. "They've been searching for you for years. And now, here you are." Clara's vision blurred as tears filled her eyes. She shook her head, trying to deny it, but deep down, she knew it was true. The way Linda had looked at her, the way John had stood up to her, it all made sense now. "Why are you telling me this?" she choked out. "Because you deserve to know," Mr. Thompson said. "And because they deserve a chance to know you." Clara's mind was a whirlwind of emotions, anger, fear, sadness, and something she couldn't quite name. She turned away, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need a minute." Clara retreated to the galley, her mind spinning. She leaned against the wall, her chest heaving as she tried to process what Mr. Thompson had just told her. "John and Linda, my birth parents?" The idea felt surreal, like something out of a movie. She glanced at the photograph still clutched in her hand. The baby in the picture looked so innocent, so unaware of the life that lay ahead. Clara's eyes welled up as she traced the edges of the photo, her heart aching with a mix of longing and resentment. "Why now?" she whispered to herself. "Why after all these years?" Before she could gather her thoughts, the galley door slid open. Clara quickly wiped her tears and straightened up, expecting to see a colleague. Instead, it was John and Linda. The couple stood hesitantly in the doorway, their expressions a mix of hope and apprehension. Linda's eyes were red from crying, and John's face was etched with worry. "Clara," Linda began softly, her voice trembling. "Can we talk?" Clara's first instinct was to push them away, to retreat behind the walls she had built so carefully. But something in Linda's eyes stopped her. There was a vulnerability there, a raw honesty that mirrored her own. I don't know what to say," Clara admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. John stepped forward, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "We don't expect anything from you," he said. "We just want you to know the truth." Clara looked down at the photograph again, her fingers tightening around it. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked, her voice cracking. Linda's eyes filled with tears. "We didn't know where you were. We tried to find you, but the adoption was closed. We thought it was what was best for you." Clara's chest tightened. "Best for me? Do you have any idea what it's like to grow up feeling like you don't belong? To wonder why your own parents didn't want you?" John's face crumpled, and Linda reached out a hand, though she didn't dare touch Clara. "We did want you," Linda said, her voice breaking. "We loved you so much. But we were young and struggling. We thought giving you up would give you a better life." Clara shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "A better life? Do you know what my life has been like? I've spent years trying to prove myself, trying to be enough, because I always felt like I wasn't." John stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm. "Clara, we never stopped thinking about you. Not a day went by that we didn't wonder where you were, if you were happy. You were always a part of us." Clara's defenses began to crumble. She wanted to stay angry, to hold on to the resentment that had fueled her for so long. But looking at John and Linda, she saw something she hadn't expected: pain. The same pain she had carried for years. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said quietly. Linda nodded, her tears falling freely. "We don't expect you to. We just want you to know that we're here. And if you're willing, we'd like to get to know you." The galley fell silent, the only sound the hum of the plane's engines. Clara looked at the photograph one last time before handing it back to Linda. "I need time," she said finally. "This is a lot." John and Linda exchanged a glance before nodding. "We understand," John said. "Take all the time you need." As they turned to leave, Clara felt a sudden pang of fear. What if this was her only chance? What if she let them walk away and regretted it forever? "Wait," she called out, her voice trembling. John and Linda turned back, their eyes filled with hope. Clara took a deep breath, her heart pounding. Maybe we can start with a conversation." Linda's face lit up, and John's eyes glistened with tears. "We'd like that," Linda said softly. For the first time in years, Clara felt a flicker of something she had long forgotten: hope. The plane's cabin was quiet, the soft hum of the engines providing a steady backdrop to the emotional storm unfolding in the galley. Clara, John, and Linda stood together, the weight of decades of separation and unspoken pain hanging heavily in the air. Clara took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she looked at the couple before her. "I don't even know where to start," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Linda reached out tentatively, her hand hovering in the space between them. "You don't have to say anything right now," she said gently. "We just want to listen." Clara nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "All my life, I've felt like something was missing. Like I didn't belong. And now I find out that the people who were supposed to love me just gave me away." John's face crumpled, and he took a step closer. "Clara, we never wanted to give you up. But we were young and scared. We didn't have the means to give you the life we thought you deserved." Linda nodded, her voice trembling. "We thought adoption would give you opportunities we couldn't provide. We wanted you to have a better life, even if it meant breaking our own hearts." Clara's chest tightened as she listened. She had spent so many years building walls, convincing herself that she didn't need anyone. But now, faced with the raw honesty in their eyes, those walls began to crack. "Did you ever try to find me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Every day," John said without hesitation. "We wrote letters, made calls, did everything we could. But the adoption was closed, and we hit dead ends at every turn." Linda reached into her bag and pulled out a small, worn notebook. She handed it to Clara, her hands shaking. "This is for you. It's everything we wanted to say but never had the chance to." Clara took the notebook, her fingers brushing against the faded cover. She opened it to the first page and saw a handwritten note. "To our precious daughter. We may not be with you, but you are always in our hearts. We love you more than words can say, and we hope one day you'll understand why we made this choice." Tears streamed down Clara's face as she flipped through the pages. Each one was filled with letters, poems, and memories, proof of a love that had never faded. "I didn't know," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't know you cared." Linda reached out and gently took Clara's hand. "We've always cared. And we're so sorry for the pain we caused you. If we could go back and do things differently, we would." John stepped closer, his eyes filled with tears. "We don't expect you to forgive us. But we want you to know that we're here now. And we'll do whatever it takes to make things right." Clara looked at them, her heart aching with a mix of emotions she couldn't fully process. For so long, she had carried the weight of abandonment, convinced that she was unworthy of love. But now, faced with the truth, she realized that the story was far more complicated than she had ever imagined. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said honestly. "But I want to try." Linda's face lit up with hope, and John's eyes glistened with tears. "That's all we can ask for," Linda said softly. The three of them stood together in the galley, the silence between them filled with unspoken words and the promise of a new beginning. For the first time in years, Clara felt a glimmer of hope, a chance to heal the wounds of the past and build something new. The remainder of the flight passed in a blur for Clara. She moved through her duties mechanically, her mind still reeling from the emotional whirlwind of the past hour. John and Linda returned to their seats, but the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. Passengers who had earlier whispered about the confrontation now exchanged curious glances, sensing that something profound had transpired. Clara found herself stealing glances at the couple whenever she could. Each time, she was struck by the same thought: these are my parents. The realization was both overwhelming and surreal. She had spent her entire life building an identity around the idea of being alone, of being self-sufficient. Now, that identity was being challenged in ways she hadn't imagined. As the plane began its descent, Clara's colleague approached her, concern etched on her face. "Clara, are you okay? You've been quiet ever since, well, you know." Clara forced a smile. "I'm fine. Just a lot on my mind." Her colleague hesitated, then placed a hand on Clara's shoulder. "If you need to talk, I'm here." Clara nodded, grateful for the support but unsure how to put her feelings into words. How could she explain that the couple in row 3, the ones she had treated so poorly, were her birth parents? It felt like something out of a soap opera, not her life. When the plane finally touched down, Clara took a deep breath, steeling herself for what came next. She knew she couldn't avoid John and Linda forever. As passengers began to disembark, she made her way to their row, her heart pounding. John and Linda were gathering their belongings when they noticed her approach. Linda's eyes lit up, while John gave her a tentative smile. "Clara," Linda said softly. "We weren't sure if we'd see you again before we left." Clara swallowed hard, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. I I wanted to say something before you go. John and Linda exchanged a glance before nodding. Of course, John said. We're listening. Clara took a deep breath, her voice trembling. I don't know where we go from here. This is all so overwhelming. But I want you to know that I'm willing to try. To get to know you. To understand. Linda's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out to take Clara's hand. That's all we've ever wanted, she said, her voice breaking. John stepped closer, his expression filled with emotion. We're not perfect, Clara. We've made mistakes, big ones. But we love you. And we're here for you, no matter what. Clara felt a lump form in her throat. For so long, she had convinced herself that she didn't need anyone, that she was better off alone. But standing there, faced with the unconditional love of the parents she had never known, she realized how much she had been missing. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. As the last of the passengers filed out of the cabin, Clara, John, and Linda stood together. The weight of the past and the promise of the future hanging in the air. It wasn't a perfect moment, there were still wounds to heal and questions to answer, but it was a start. The airport terminal was bustling with activity, but for Clara, John, and Linda, the noise and chaos seemed to fade into the background. They stood together near the baggage claim, the three of them forming a small, quiet island amidst the sea of travelers. Clara glanced at John and Linda, her emotions still raw but her heart lighter than it had been in years. I don't know what happens next, she admitted, her voice soft but steady. But I want to figure it out. Together. Linda's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out to squeeze Clara's hand. We do too, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Whatever you need, whatever you're comfortable with, we'll take it one step at a time. John nodded, his expression filled with quiet determination. We've missed so much already. We don't want to waste another moment. Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. It wasn't just the joy of finding her parents, it was the hope of healing, of building something new from the broken pieces of the past. As they walked out of the airport together, Clara couldn't help but reflect on everything that had brought them to this moment. The pain, the anger, the years of wondering and waiting, it had all led her here. And while the road ahead wouldn't be easy, she knew it was one worth taking. You know, she said, breaking the silence, I spent so much of my life running from my past, trying to prove that I didn't need anyone. But now, I think I was wrong. John and Linda exchanged a glance, their eyes filled with love and pride. You're stronger than you realize, Clara, John said. And you don't have to do this alone anymore. Linda nodded, her voice gentle but firm. Family isn't just about where you come from. It's about who stands by you, who loves you no matter what. And we're here for you, always. Clara smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached her eyes for the first time in what felt like forever. Thank you, she said softly. For not giving up on me. As they stepped into the sunlight, Clara felt a sense of peace settle over her. The journey ahead would be filled with challenges and uncertainties, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She had found her parents, but more importantly, she had found herself.